Shalom and welcome to this home edition of the Middle East Report. And in this program today, we'll be discussing Judea and Samaria. That is the biblical heartland for Israel and the battle that's intensifying for this land. And in this program today, I'm joined by Sondra Baras, who is the director of the Christian Friends of the Israeli Communities in Judea and Samaria. And she's joining us all the way from the biblical heartland of Israel. Sondra, warm welcome to the Middle East Report.
Thank you. It's great to be back.
It's great to see you as well. We know that this past year has been an extremely difficult year for all of us with COVID-19, and it must be very difficult for you as well, not being able to travel the world and talk about the importance of Judea and Samaria to the Jewish people, and also very difficult as well not having any Christian tourists as well. So how have you coped during the past year with COVID-19?
Well, first of all, I have to say we've missed you. We've missed all your wonderful faces, and a regular year. I think a week didn't go by that we didn't have at least some visitors coming to us, Christians from various countries in the world, where I had the ability to show them around, take them. I mean, I live and work in Samaria. I would host them in my office, in my home, take them to communities in Samaria or in Judea. And it's always a thrill to me to watch as people, especially first timers to the area, you take them up to this great mountain and you say, okay, that's Mount Gerizim, that's Mount Ebal, that's the Oak of Moreh. This is where God spoke to Abraham. This is where it all happened. And they're just like, oh my goodness. It's like you see the penny drop, as you're talking to them. And so that, of course, we missed. One of the things that we did do is up our film and Zoom kind of activities. I mean, we never did anything with Zoom before. And I always thank God for this wonderful, he's put the wisdom in somebody's brain to put this together. And so we've done virtual tours, and we've enabled people to go on our website and just kind of click and at least get some level of feeling that, they're here. And I hope that one day soon you will be able to come back.
No, it's very special. My what I feel very sad about is the fact there are so many Christian tours to Israel. There was prior to COVID-19, and yet very few of those Christian tours ever went to visit the Shomron, Judea and Samaria, and to see the biblical heartland for themselves. And for any Christian that has a love and a passion for Israel, they have to visit Shiloh, where the Ark of the Covenant rested. And it just feels like there the Bible comes alive, and that Jerusalem has a very special feeling, but so does Judea and Samaria. And I came away thinking, I've done 19, 20 plus trips to Israel, but I haven't seen this before. And I felt like I haven't really visited Israel until I'd seen Judea and Samaria.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And one of the things, I feel as much as we had a difficult year, I think all of us have to look and see, did we have blessings in this past year, despite the difficulties? And if there is one blessing, it's the fact that we did go out there and realize that if we can't bring tourists themselves to see Shiloh and Hebron and the biblical mountains or the communities that we usually take people into the communities to meet people, then we need to bring it to them by film. And so I'm hoping now, of course, we use this now for people who really want to see and want to connect. But I'm hoping that these films will also help people when they do start planning tours to Israel, that we will give them these films and say, when you plan your next trip to Israel, don't just look at Jerusalem and the Galilee. Look at this. Look at this film we just did about, something in the Jordan Valley, something in Judea and Samaria. And we're hoping that will kind of whet their appetite so that the tour leaders will put that in and will realize that this is so essential for them to see, not just because it's beautiful, but because it is biblically essential.
Absolutely. And Sondra, just tell us something about that beautiful background you got behind you. It's not a virtual reality set. These are
No.
the trees and the flowers in Judea,
Right.
which the Bible said would blossom when the Jewish
Right.
people
Well,
returned
I'm
to that land.
sitting at home in my kitchen, and you see behind me, I have opened the door. We have a gorgeous day today, and that's my patio with the trees, and it's just gorgeous. It's a beautiful day, and that's something, especially people in England. You don't have nearly enough warm and sunny days. So this is it. This is the country of sunshine, and it really is beautiful.
That's definitely the case at the moment as we're recording this program, Sondra. Now we know that Israel is leading the world in terms of the vaccination, in terms of opening up
Right.
Israeli societies. Only a couple of weeks ago, that the Israelis threw away their face masks, with the social distancing being abandoned, people going into cinemas and restaurants as well, and life returning to somewhat normal life after
Right.
COVID-19. But this
Right.
also gives an opportunity for countries like Britain as well, who's also doing well in terms of defeating COVID, that a travel corridor may open up. What would that mean for Christian tourists then to come back and visit Israel and visit the Holy Land? But they have to visit Judea and Samaria.
100%. And we're taking it slow in Israel, and I think it's wise because last summer when the numbers started going down, we opened up, and it proved to be too fast, and the numbers then skyrocketed again. And so we've now come out of months and months of different types of lockdown. And we're finally opening up, not completely, like we don't have to wear face masks outside, but when we do go inside, to a shopping center or to a theater or whatever, we do have to have our masks on. And what has really enabled us to be where we are today is the massive vaccine campaign. We now have more than 5 million people who have been vaccinated. Vast majority of adults, and we are, of course, at this point, are not able to vaccinate those under 16, and hopefully we will start vaccinating children from the age of 12 next week. So that is moving. But what has become quite clear is that in opening up for tourism, which has not happened yet, but it should happen soon, it will happen gradually. And the people who are going to be allowed to enter will have to have been vaccinated and have some kind of certification to indicate that they have been vaccinated, or possibly have had COVID and have some kind of certification that they have the antibodies. So this is definitely what it's going to be looking like for at least another year. It's possible that if we get to a point where, COVID has disappeared from our lives, then those kind of restrictions will ease up. But I'm hoping that there will be enough people who will have decided to take the vaccine and will come back because we miss you and we want to see you here.
Definitely, we've missed Israel as well. I certainly have, anyway. And Sondra, can you talk us through this excellent video that you produced called "Bridging the Distance and Connecting to Israel"?
Well, it's a video that really tells us about what we do, what Christian Friends of Israeli Communities is doing. And it was very important for us to have this video available when people are not here, and not just when people are not here. When I usually in a normal year travel, I go to the UK once a year. I go to the States several times a year. I go to Australia, gone to countries in Asia, and all that came to a total halt last March. And, I'm hoping to start traveling again gradually, depending on the countries and where I'm able to come in and where not. But this is a film we did so that we can enable you to connect to us virtually, even while we cannot meet directly.
And Sondra, I think we have to really, before we kind of discuss some of the kind of more meatier issues affecting you and your community, I think we have to pay respect and also about the horrible tragedy that took place in Israel, which was it 45 Orthodox Jewish people
45.
were killed in a horrible stampede with over 100 injured, and this was at Mount Moron in the Galilee. Can you share with us the impact that this has had on Israel and also your community as well?
This terrible, terrible tragedy is clearly has put us all into great sorrow. The Sunday immediately following the event was declared a day of mourning, official mourning, and it's clear to us now that what happened there was really negligence on the part of the authorities or the police, or it's not exactly clear who, and they're going to be doing investigating, but there were a lot of problems with the infrastructure there that meant that when having all these people there, it was basically, so many people said it's an annual event, and actually this year, because of COVID, there were fewer people there than other years, even though there were tens of thousands there. But this is an annual event that for years, people have come away from that event saying it is a miracle that we haven't had some kind of crushing stampede or some kind of collapse of stairs or paths or whatever. And unfortunately, when people warn about these things, unfortunately, if it doesn't become the most important issue of the government's agenda, if they're busy dealing with terrorists, or if they're busy dealing with Iran, or they're busy dealing with petty politics, sometimes they don't deal with things like this, which requires a real, it's a national park, it's a national area, it's something that needs to be taken care of. And unfortunately, you have a tragedy like this, 45 people killed in a stampede, and people were acting fine. It was just so many people that when the people at the beginning, and there was a slippery area and some people slipped and fell, there was just no way to stop what happened because there were just too many people in a small place with terrible infrastructure. And I'm just hoping that all of us, our government and institutions learn their lesson and ensure that something like this never happens again.
I mean, it just reminds me of what happened in this country in 1989, called the Hillsborough tragedy, which was a football match between it was a Liverpool Football Club and another club. Can't remember the actual team, but it's when we had crowds standing at stadiums and the fans became crushed and everything else. It's just absolutely horrible. So, is this now on the political agenda now of the government to actually improve the health and safety for these particular religious festivals?
Well, I would say that this is an issue that crosses all political lines. There is total consensus in Israel that, this has to be taken care of. I think it requires some legal issues that are stupid, bureaucratic issues, but it has to be done. And I'm confident that whoever is the next prime minister, this will be something that will be done. There's already investigations that have begun to look into this. There have been plans that were on the table already for years and what needs to be done, and they were just ignored. And I don't think it will be ignored again. So I think everybody is confident that Meron will be a very safe place next year. The question we all ask is, are there other Merons out there? Are there other places that various government agencies know are problematic and it has not been taken care of? And that is really more the kind of statements and issues that are being pushed to the forefront today. Our pressure of the people on our government officials, don't let this stuff get buried. You got to take care of this before there's a tragedy.
Absolutely. So let's look at this excellent CBN report that looks at the tragedy that occurred at Mount Moron.
The tragedy occurred when a stampede began at the festival of Lag BaOmer, a Jewish holiday honoring a rabbi and mystic from the 2nd century who was buried on Mount Meron in northern Israel. The disaster was apparently caused by overcrowding with large numbers together in a narrow passage.
We saw people pushing over the other, and slowly we saw people being trampled. At this point, when I saw the people, I started to go outside. There, we saw evacuating people every moment and conducting CPR.
It was the first religious gathering of its size to be held legally since Israel lifted nearly all restrictions from the COVID pandemic.
Absolutely difficult sights. I'm about 10 years a paramedic, and I don't remember I've seen sights like these. We are in a mass casualty incident. I see here tens of people laying on the floor. I see here tens of injured, walking and bleeding. I see here children and adults. Very difficult sights.
The Israeli military came in to help evacuate the wounded. Officials estimate 100,000, mostly ultra-Orthodox Jews, gathered to celebrate the festival. Large crowds traditionally light bonfires, pray, and dance as part of the celebrations. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu visited the site and earlier had called it a great tragedy. The stampede is likely to have a political impact as well. Netanyahu needs the support of his longtime allies, the ultra-Orthodox, to maintain any hopes he might have of staying in power. Today, efforts are underway to identify the victims and connect families with missing relatives. Authorities will be searching for answers. As Netanyahu said, everyone will be praying for the victims. Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
And Sondra, where you live is not only is it beautiful, but the biblical connection to the land. It's almost as if you open up the Word of God and it comes alive where you are. What would you say, for example, of some of the dangers as well? Because in recent days we've seen a horrible drive-by shooting take place and an upsurge in Palestinian violence against your communities. Can you just give us a little bit of an update of why we're seeing this increase in violent attacks and terror attacks against your communities?
Well, definitely we're seeing an increase. We just had a terrible drive-by shooting where 3 people were killed and 2 of them very seriously injured. They really need our prayers. 2 young boys. These were kids waiting at a bus stop to go back to school, and just a Palestinian car drove by, takes out a gun, shoots, and it's a tragedy. And of course we're praying for the health and well-being of these kids, but this was not an isolated event. Just before then, we had 2 different stabbing or attempted stabbing events in Gush Etzion, which is in Judea, just south of Jerusalem. Last week, we had ongoing riots in Jerusalem near Damascus Gate, where Palestinians, mostly from East Jerusalem, were becoming very violent. And there's a lot of theories about this. One of them is that, which I think is very credible, is that the Palestinian Authority kind of turns on and off the spigot, They are no friends of Israel, and they decide when violence serves their interests and when it doesn't serve their interests. And right now, they're in a situation where elections in the Palestinian Authority have not taken place in 15 years. And the Palestinians are getting very agitated. I mean, this has become, Abbas has basically turned this into a dictatorship. There's tremendous disaffection against the Palestinian Authority. And in fact, it seems clear that if elections were held, the Fatah ruling faction and Abbas and everybody that he represents would lose. And therefore, he's canceling these elections. But he wants to be able to blame Israel. And so this is a pattern that repeats itself all the time. Whenever the Palestinian Authority does something that they know is unpopular, and they're doing it for their own selfish interest to line their own pockets or to preserve their ridiculous, corrupt authority, they need to be able to blame Israel. So how do you blame Israel? You kind of turn on the spigot. You say, okay, now it's okay. You can go and have terrorism attacks. And it's also coming from the Hamas, which is trying to gain more popularity and say, look, this is good. This is what we're trying to do. And so I see that this really is the background for this upsurge. But whatever it may be, we're much more concerned in the long run of where this could play out, because now we have a new president in the United States, in the White House, who is definitely not sympathetic to the communities in Judea and Samaria. He's much more sympathetic to Abbas and the Palestinian Authority than we saw, of course, under Trump. But more than that, he has taken steps that already are threatening, very threatening to Israel, such as the resumption of talks with Iran, talking about going back to the Iran deal, the nuclear deal, giving Iran an opportunity to, I don't know, continue what it's doing and go nuclear, etc. But even more than that, he released millions of dollars of funds to the Palestinian Authority. There's no supervision on how those funds are spent. And what we've seen in the past, one of the reason why the Trump administration stopped those funds coming to the Palestinian Authority was because of the pay for slay policy of the Palestinian Authority, where everybody who commits a terrorist attack against Israel gets rewarded financially. Their family is supported forever, quite generously. And now all of a sudden, and that was a wonderful, wonderful incentive to stop the terrorism. Now all of a sudden, Biden released those funds. And it's very possible that that is another reason why we're now seeing an upsurge in terrorism, because the terrorists say, okay, it's going to pay. We're going to get our money.
Absolutely,
it's not good.
But also the fact that Mahmoud Abbas called for elections and hasn't been, as you said, any elections in the Palestinian Authority for the past 15 years. Is there not a real danger that if he did go ahead with these elections, then we'd see the prospect of Hamas winning that election, and therefore we'd see an even worse administrations right next to your borders in the heartland of Israel, in Judea and Samaria, and the prospect of dealing with Hamas is 100 times worse than dealing with the Palestinian Authority. And surely this is something that is playing in the minds of the Israelis, plus also the Americans as well.
Yeah, no question. This is a risk, and really, but it's not just the Hamas. Okay, within the non-Hamas affiliations, Fatah and others, there are real challengers that are coming up against Abbas. And so it's also just a personal power struggle. Some of these alternatives may well be much better for Israel than Abbas has been. They're younger. One of the issues, though, that is of most concern to the Palestinian people is a level of corruption within the Palestinian Authority. And so while Hamas is growing, it's really not clear how powerful they are. Because, for example, in Gaza, Hamas is not beloved, okay? They run things because they took it over violently, but after all these years, the people of Gaza realized that Hamas has not done them any favors, and they're living in a much, much worse situation. So, I don't see that elections are going to do anything good for Israel or for the Palestinian Authority, regardless of, who wins and how it all plays out. I wish there was some sort of mechanism that would really look at the Palestinian Arabs who are living here and do what's good for them. But none of the options on the table are currently working at all in that direction.
I mean, maybe you could discuss a little bit about the internal dynamics within Palestinian society that we don't see on our mainstream media. And that is the fact that ever since the Oslo Accords were signed in September of 1993, then implemented in 1994 with Chairman Yasser Arafat, arch terrorist. We saw that the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, a known terrorist organization, then gave prominent jobs and positions of power and influence to those members of the PLO, kicking out essentially the indigenous population that have seen that they've taken the best land, they've taken houses, they've taken jobs. And anyone who says anything differently finds out they get arrested or even tortured. So the human rights abuses are horrendous. When do you think we'll start to see a backlash amongst the Palestinian society itself for the ruling elites that belong to the PLO that have never actually lived in Israel?
So I think that this election challenge is part of that. Unfortunately, the most powerful group that's challenging the current ruling elite and who represents much less corruption is Hamas. Because Hamas presents itself, they're very involved, for example, in charity, and they're kind of represent themselves as more of the common people, and they themselves represent a fight against the corruption of the Palestinian Authority, particularly the way they take the money, etc. Unfortunately, the average Palestinian doesn't care enough about to what extent the Hamas is promoting violence or is that bad for them? They don't care about Israel so much, and so that one of the reasons that Hamas could win in an election is more because they stand against the corrupt Palestinian Authority, as opposed to what this could do to relations with Israel. However, there are a growing number of Palestinians, particularly in Judea and Samaria, who understand that their best chance for a good life is with Israel. So you have more and more Palestinians who are eager to work in Israel, who, as part of working in Israel, not just in Israel, they're working in the communities in Judea and Samaria. They're developing relations. We have more and more business partnerships that are going on between Jews who live in Judea and Samaria and Arabs who live in Judea and Samaria. And this is creating a grassroots paradigm for a whole different way of looking at things. Now, purposely, all of these initiatives are staying away from politics, because the idea is if we have any hope of offering an alternative, it's going to have to be from the ground up, and it will have to be based on personal relations and economics. Okay, if you're going to force a Palestinian into a corner and say, do you want to be part of a Jewish state? They may not be so keen. But if you're going to say to them, would you like to be in a situation where you have free relations with Israel and you're benefiting from Israel, they're going to vote 100% in favor. And so this, in my opinion, needs to be the direction we're going at. And it was the direction that it seemed the Trump administration was moving towards. And one of the things that has created a total change in perspective on this issue are the Abraham Accords. Because what we saw for the first time was very wealthy and very important Gulf states, okay, suddenly approaching Israel as economic equals, okay? Neither is feeling threatened by the other. And there's real friendship and there's real cooperation going on. And so your Palestinian sitting at home watching TV and seeing this going on is beginning to understand, wait a second, the Jews don't hate us because we're Arabs. The Jews want to do business with us. We got to get out of this anti-Semitic, stuff that we've been taught. So more and more of these young Palestinians who are hooked to the internet, seeing what's going on, are moving more into that kind of more pragmatic approach. And that's the future. And it's not going to happen overnight. But we have to make sure that whatever steps we do take fosters that, as rather than these crazy political arrangements.
Excellent. And Sondra, last time we did a program together last summer was discussing the possible annexation plan, which was part of President Trump's peace initiative, and the prospect that your communities could actually be incorporated into Israel proper, and Israeli law and sovereignty would extend to your communities in Judea and Samaria. But and that was sacrificed for the Abraham Accords. In your opinion, was that sacrifice a price worth paying, or do you think that the government made a major mistake in not pursuing the idea of annexation, particularly now that President Trump is no longer in the White House?
There's no question on my part that it was a mistake for Israel not to start with the annexation or applying sovereignty, at least to some of the areas in Area C. And I am not sure that that was something that had to be done in order to have the Abraham Accords. Not a single Arab leader ever said that it was a condition of, and the texts themselves of the Accords never talked about freezing the sovereignty in exchange for the Abraham Accords. and we don't really know what's happening because there were different statements from different people, both in the United States and in Israel, that are contradictory statements. So we really don't know what happened. In Israel, for example, there was the head of Kahol Lavan, Benny Gantz, who was supposedly a partner of Netanyahu in this crazy national unity government that we've had this past year, a totally ineffectual government. He's made a statement recently that said he was the one who blocked it, that Netanyahu was ready to go forward with the annexation and he blocked it. So was this a question of petty politics here in Israel? We have no idea. It is something that absolutely definitely damaged our trust in Netanyahu, because we do believe that Netanyahu had the ability to do this. Secretary of State, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo made it very clear that he would support this kind of thing, as did President Trump. And, you know, to delay it by a couple of weeks, fine, but I think Israel made a real mistake in not starting the process.
It almost feels as if this was a golden opportunity missed, knowing that, you know, in the States with President Trump and Mike Pompeo and Vice President were so supportive of Israel, so supportive of your communities in Judea and Samaria, that even Mike Pompeo himself, when he was Secretary of State, visited your region, Judea and Samaria. And that was the first by any US Secretary of State, wanting also to confront the boycotts against Israel as well. So what did that mean for you and your community to see Mike Pompeo visit Judea and Samaria for the first time?
Well, it was extremely exciting, and people like Mike Pompeo and Mike Pence, who was the vice president, have long been seen as very outspoken supporters of the communities in Judea and Samaria. And it's really no coincidence. They are both Christians, and very devout Christians, Christian Zionists, and their love for Israel transcends any political ideology or philosophy that they may have. It is coming from their very deep-rooted faith that indeed the land of Israel was given to the Jewish people. And it's a pleasure. In the same way for me that it's a pleasure when I travel and I meet Christians, or I welcome Christians here in Israel, and Christians will say, the land is yours, we know it because God said so. And for years, you know, before I encountered Christian Zionists, you know, I was trying to convey this message to people I met, whether it was in the press, and I spent a lot of years, you know, handling interviews in the secular press all over the world, and was treated with such disdain. And then being able to meet Christians who will say, you know, amen, when you say something like that. So, you know, and then to see people like that, like people like Pence and Pompeo, who are not just some nice Christian from, you know, Oklahoma or something, but really have managed to reach the highest positions of power. So that was an amazing thing. And I'm saddened. I'm saddened that they're not there. And I can only hope that our friends in the United States will continue to do whatever they can to influence the political process there, and to help us find those political leaders who will stand up and stand for the truth.
But isn't the most important thing is that these diplomats and obviously different government ministers, say British ministers as well as diplomats, we know that this is a kind of hotly contested political issue, but I think they need to look beyond that and actually visit the Shomron for themselves, to see the communities, to see the difference between your communities, for example, and the Palestinian communities. And one thing that struck me recently was, you know, driving down the Jordan Valley from the Galilee, and you see some of the Jewish farms full of flowers, full of trees, full of life, and then areas that the Palestinians are in control of literally just gone to desert, and just seeing goats across this desert land. And maybe they need to see this area for themselves to be able to know what the truth is, rather than believing all the lies of the Palestinian Authority. And now we see the weakening of the Arab position towards Israel, that the issue of Judea and Samaria probably become less of an issue in the coming years as well. So how important is it that you do get high profile visitors of ministers of state from various governments, and they do a fact-finding mission for themselves rather than believing all the lies put out by our mainstream media and by the Palestinian Authority propaganda machine?
Well, I agree 100%. In fact, one of the last Christian groups that I hosted here in Samaria before COVID was a group of Dutch parliamentarians from a Dutch Christian party. And it was a fascinating experience. And they were, of course, very open-minded and very interested in learning more. And I took them to see communities, and I took them to see the Barkana Industrial Park in Samaria, where they could see Jews and Arabs working together side by side. And Arabs came before them and told them how positive their experience is, how well they are treated, and how they are making 2 to 3 times more than they would make if they would be working in one of the Palestinian companies or businesses in their own area. Now, what was fascinating was theirs was a fact-finding mission, and they tried very much to keep it balanced. And so they were spending the morning with me, and they were supposed to go from me to Ramallah and be the guests of the Palestinian Authority so they could hear their position. Well, when the Palestinian Authority discovered that they were spending the morning with me, they refused to accept them. And I'm sitting with these people, and they're getting these phone calls from the Palestinian Authority saying, why are you in the settlements, and who are you with? And they're explaining, look, we want to see both sides, and this is for your good. We want to hear your point of view. And in the end, they wouldn't let them come. So to me, that said more than anything. Unfortunately, too many European politicians only hear the Palestinian side and are not even willing to come in and hear us. Even if you have a different opinion, be willing to see us. And most of the time they're not. But you could see it's a zero game, that I can understand what happens, because the Europeans want to see themselves as being at least sympathetic to the Palestinians. And they know that if they come in and visit with us as well, the Palestinians will boycott them. I don't know why that matters to them, but for some reason it does. And it's the rare politician in Europe that will be willing to stand up and say, no, we're going to also visit the Jews in Judea and Samaria.
Because a few years ago, when I was doing a program called the European Report, and actually recording a program in the European Parliament in Brussels, one of the MEPs there was chairman of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, an Italian MEP, who wanted to know what all the fuss was about in Judea and Samaria. And so therefore he visited Judea and Samaria for himself and fell in love with the communities and became such a strong advocate for your communities that he spoke up for them in the European Parliament, would have some of the Jewish settlers come and speak in the European Parliament, which would really anger those Palestinian supporters within the European Parliament. But it just shows you what can be done if politicians and our leaders have an open mind, an open heart, and actually see the territory for themselves, and see how your communities are run in comparison to that of the Palestinian Authority.
Of course.
Make the world a so much better place, surely.
Absolutely. Look, it's about people,
Exactly.
And if we're dealing with Arabs who want to murder us, there's nothing to talk about. But if we're dealing with Arabs who want to figure out how to live with us, there's a lot to talk about. And if the governments around the world would focus on that issue, Jews are not going to leave Judea and Samaria. This is our historical, biblical homeland. But we didn't come here to drive out the Arabs. We have already made their lives better. We can do so much more. But let's get the attitude in the right place on the part of the international diplomats and say, how can we help the Arabs have their lives better? And that is only going to be done by encouraging peaceful coexistence between both populations who are living here in the same place.
Absolutely. And now turning our thoughts to the current occupant in the White House, Joe Biden and the Democrats, and how they are dismantling President Trump's very successful Middle Eastern foreign policies. As you mentioned earlier in the program, trying to re-engage with the Iranian regime on its nuclear weapons program, ignoring the fact that it's a state sponsor of international terrorism, an absolute menace to the world and also to the region. And also also then the prospect of refunding and supporting the Palestinian Authority, also releasing funds such as 260 million US dollars, and that's American taxpayers' dollars, to a terrorist entity, and put their focus on so-called human rights and supporting moves towards a Palestinian state. How is your community responding to the challenges of having a hostile administration in the White House?
Well, from our perspective in Judea and Samaria, we have been here through hostile Israeli governments and supportive Israeli governments. We have been here through mostly hostile American governments, totally hostile European governments from the beginning. So the Trump administration was a gift, okay? But I don't think anybody fooled themselves into thinking that this is something that was going to last forever. But it doesn't change who we are and what we're doing, because we are always going to be moving forward. And if that means building more homes, encouraging more people to live here, we're almost 500,000 Jews living in Judea and Samaria, and there are new homes being built all the time. We would have been much larger population if we didn't have these various building limitations where our government has either been forced or felt they needed to submit to international pressure. So even when there's building freezes, we don't give up. And today there are new initiatives for investment here in Judea and Samaria, investment that includes Palestinian and Palestinian and Jewish joint initiatives. There's a lot going on. If the terrorism rears its head and we're going to start feeling more at risk again, well, then we're going to go out and make people safer. And one of the things we're doing at Christian Friends of Israeli Communities is raising money for surveillance cameras and security equipment so that we can ensure that the people living here are safer. We are not going to leave. We're going to do whatever we can to continue to strengthen our presence here. And if anything brought the American administration under Trump to a recognition of who we are, it's because we were here, okay? That was first and foremost, that we're here, we're a fact on the ground. And the more we're a fact on the ground, the more even some of the people who are most against us are going to understand that they're not going to be able to push us anywhere. And that's the most important thing, to strengthen our presence here.
Absolutely, and that's encouraging as well. And how does the chaotic Israeli government play into this, knowing that as an Israelis, you've had 4 elections in 2 years, with the prospect of another 5th election if there isn't a government being formed? But the one ray of sunshine out of all of this, isn't it? The fact is that the right-wing coalition blocs hold the majority of views in Israelis, and that's reflected in the Israeli Knesset. So how important is it that you have that support for your communities, not only from the ruling Likud party, but from other right-wing political blocs as well?
Well, to me, first of all, I think many of us are very disappointed in the Likud. They're clearly right-wing, but especially in recent years, I think they have been much more focused on supporting Netanyahu. Netanyahu has become a more and more problematic prime minister in many ways. So if, like this whole sovereignty issue, I keep asking myself, if Netanyahu was so much on our side, why didn't he apply sovereignty, even in a limited symbolic way, to something, to one area, to one community? He could have done it, and he didn't. And so while I would say the vast majority of the members of Knesset are definitely right-wing in orientation, pro-Judea and Samaria, there's been all these other political machinations that get in the way. Our hope is that there will be a government. Today, because Netanyahu has become so problematic, and also the way he's treated some of the other right-wing members of the Knesset, has made it almost impossible for them all to sit together in one government. And so our feeling today, I would say many, many people, I speak for myself, but I think I represent a lot of people, is that the most important thing right now is that we have a stable government. Even if that means having some level of compromise between right and left. I believe the talented politicians who are definitely right-wing in orientation will be able to put forward the most important of our agendas because of the fact that we have this majority in the Knesset. And at some point, the members of the Knesset have to vote for the ideas much more important than their personal politics. And that's what we're hoping for. But none of this can happen without a stable government. We have to see. I mean, it's a very, it could be that by the time this is aired, the stable government will have already happened. But
that's going to happen in a week, though. That's got to happen in a week, and we believe in miracles, so that is possible.
It could happen.
But knowing what Israeli politics is like, I need a little bit more convincing, I think.
Well, look, tonight, Netanyahu loses his mandate.
Ooh.
Tonight, okay? And then the president has to decide if he's going to give it to Lapid, if he's going to give it to Bennett, or if he's going to give it to the Knesset. And so it may well be that in a week we will know more.
Oh,
we'll see.
Let's hope and pray for a stable government. I love what you said, and particularly that now there are 500,000 Jewish people living in the biblical heartland of Israel, and really this has only come about really since Israel's war in '67. So that's just over 50 years. And that fulfillment of biblical prophecy. Can you share with us how significant this is, that you are living in such a strategic area of Israel, but also it's part of your Jewish heritage? And in the past 50 years, we've seen prophecies fulfilled, such as Ezekiel 37 and others that talk about the hills of Judea being populated, talking about the vineyards being re-established up there. What is it like knowing that you're living and working in a community in which God's word is being fulfilled? I mean, no one can say that about London. No one can say that about New York or Washington, D.C., or even other parts of Israel, but they can say that about your community.
Well, for me, I was born in the United States. And so the very decision that I made as a young adult to come to Israel was all part of this, because to me, when I was as a kid, it was the 6-Day War, and at that point, Judea and Samaria came in under Israel's control. And before that, before I was born, of course, the state of Israel was established in 1948. And so when I, as a young teenager, am looking at these events, and at the same time, I'm studying Bible, because I came from a very strongly identified Jewish family. I had a very strong biblical education from a very young age. And so when I see the Bible on the one hand, and I read the news on the other, to me, it was so obvious, which is one of the reasons I moved to Israel, because I said, wow, I mean, God is actually doing today, for the first time in centuries, what he promised to do. How can I, stand back? I want to be part of the action, And so that's why I moved to Israel. And I would say the people who came to live in Judea and Samaria, certainly the original pioneers and the people who came from more ideological reasons, are coming out of that kind of awareness. We are living in miraculous times. We just celebrated a few weeks ago Israel Independence Day. For religious Jews, Israel Independence Day is a religious holiday. We go to the synagogue and we sing psalms of praise. And we thank God for this amazing miracle, which we call the beginning of the redemption. So, and as a religious Jew, I believe in the redemption. I believe in the coming of Messiah. Now, Christians and Jews have an argument about whether he's coming first or second time. We believe he's coming first time. But for us, the idea of a coming of a Messiah and an ultimate redemption is 100% real. And so here we are living in the biblical heartland, living in the places, as you mentioned, Ezekiel talks about the mountains of Israel coming to life again, and Amos talking about planting them again on this land, never to be uprooted. Jeremiah talks about, again, planting vineyards on the mountains of Samaria. All of these things and more that we read, and we know we're part of it. What can be more exciting than that?
No, it's incredibly exciting. And what role can Christian Zionists play, particularly our viewers watching this program that maybe have never been to Judea and Samaria? And I can only encourage you to do so, because it is very special up there. But how can they get involved? Well, by supporting your communities, because you are literally fulfilling a biblical mandate to live in the biblical heartland of Israel.
Well, when we started Christian Friends of Israeli Communities, that was exactly the idea, to give Christians who love Israel and who recognize the biblical significance of what's going on, give them a vehicle to understand it better, to connect directly with these communities and with the people who live there, and to support what we're doing. And I want to encourage everyone to get on our website at cfoic.com and learn more. Sign up for our mailing list. You can get a lot of information. We have biblical teachings. We have information about the communities, virtual tours in Judea and Samaria. But if you want to actually do something that can help, you can donate. You can give money, and it doesn't matter if you're giving £5 or £1,000 or anything in between. Every single bit helps. So for example, right now, we are seeing an upsurge in terrorism. Now, for the past several months, we have been raising funds for surveillance cameras in isolated communities. And it is those surveillance cameras that help the communities to identify the terrorist before he has an opportunity to kill somebody or to stab somebody. And sometimes we're too late. You know, sometimes these events happen in places where, had there been surveillance cameras there, maybe that terrorist attack wouldn't have happened. I can tell you that we've put surveillance cameras in communities where attacks were prevented. And we have the footage of it. So this is one of the most important things that we're working on right now. But in addition, we have all kinds of ways that you can help, whether it's to help children or senior citizens, or just do things to help strengthen the communities and make them more permanent and flourishing and more attractive, so that more and more Jews will move here. And this is something every single one of you as Christian Zionists can do to help and support and strengthen the Jewish presence in Judea and Samaria.
Sondra, thank you so much for being my guest on this home edition of the Middle East Report. Always a pleasure to speak with you. And thank you for giving us an update. You're in our thoughts, you're in our prayers. And yeah, looking forward to when this travel corridor opens and we can go and visit the biblical heartland of Israel, that is Judea and Samaria.
Wonderful. We'll be there to meet you.
Pleasure. And I just want to thank you for watching this program today. There can be no doubt that the communities in Judea and Samaria, which is the biblical heartland of Israel, face a tremendous political battle with the Biden administration, with hostility coming from Europe and even our own British government. But they need to know the truth for themselves, that we are seeing those communities come alive in fulfillment of biblical prophecy, and this territory and land belongs to the Jewish people. So let's keep them in our prayers, let's keep them in our thoughts, and let's stand up for these brave and courageous communities living in the biblical heartland of Israel. And I want to thank you for watching today's home edition of the Middle East Report.